We need to be familiar with the Stamp Act, the Boston Massacre, and the Boston Tea Party, and how each of these relate to the eventual Revolutionary War. And the concept that kind of circles these three is that the British are now wanting to tax the colonists, but they're not giving them the ability to vote. So that's the big deal. Okay, so let's look at each of them. The Stamp Act was first, and it's in 1765. The Stamp Act was the first international tax levied directly on American colonists by the British government. The act, which imposed a tax on all paper documents in the colonies, came at a time when the British Empire was deep in debt from the 7 Years' War, which was from 1756 to 1763, and the British were looking for its North American colonies as a revenue source. Arguing that only their own representative assemblies could tax them, the colonists insisted that the act was unconstitutional, and they resorted to mob violence to intimidate stamp collectors into resigning. Parliament eventually repealed the Stamp Act in 1766, but issued a declaratory act at the same time to reform its authority to pass any colonial legislation it saw fit. The issue of taxation and representation raised by the Stamp Act strained relations with the colonies to the point that 10 years later, the colonists rose in armed rebellion against the British. The Boston Massacre occurred on March 5, 1770. A squad of British soldiers came to support a sentry who was being pressed by hecklers and let loose a round of shots. Three people were killed immediately and 2 died later. The British officer in charge was arrested for manslaughter along with 8 of his men, all whom were later acquitted. The Boston Massacre is remembered as a key event in helping to galvanize the colonial public to the patriot cause. The Boston Tea Party was an act of American colonial defiance that served as a protest against taxation. Seeking to boost the troubled East India Company, British Parliament adjusted import duties with the passage of the Tea Act in 1773. While consignees in Charleston, New York, and Philadelphia rejected tea shipments, merchants in Boston refused to concede to patriot pressure. On the night of December 16, 1773, Samuel Adams and the Sons of Liberty boarded 3 ships in the Boston harbor and threw 342 chests of tea overboard. This resulted in the passage of the Punitive Coercive Acts in 1774 and pushed the two sides closer to war.